It's about the specificity of light, which is what interests me, meaning that light transmits an emotion.
Each group is premised on light and how it's manipulated and what is falling on and or not. And that's that. Most people have never been in an artist studio, and they don't know what they do, how they do it, and whatever it is. And the studio tells you everything about the artist.
I think architecture had a big influence on what I do and how I do it, particularly the early pieces, because they're all geometric, and that geometry, I'm sure, came out of interest in architecture. But it's also some people gravitate to uh, simple things and with 90-degree corners, that kind of object, and that's the kind of object I'm sort of attracted to. I went to a school here in town that was sort of definitely college prep, and the interests of that kind of school are not necessarily what I was interested in. And I couldn't get good grades anyway, so I wasn't, material for Yale or for, Stanford or Harvard, because that's where the prep was.
I've always drawn, and so, but I had no idea what an artist did. I'd never been in an artist studio, and I'm talking about making decisions about college. So it was that time of my life, and so I thought it would be prudent to do architecture.
But specifically, I didn't know what architecture was either. So I just
It was a place to be artistic, sort of.
It was in '57. I went to University of Pennsylvania from here and was there for 3 years. Then I had an opportunity to go to London and a school called the Architectural Association. So I did that, and that was heaven. That was 1961, I guess, in London. And London at that time was way ahead of the U.S. socially and how people sort of behave towards each other. It was, so that was an education. Then I went to Berkeley, and then I went to SC, and then I almost 6 months short of graduating from SC, I realized I couldn't do this. The first architect I worked for was Neutra, and that was one kind of education. And then the second architect was William Pereira. He's the guy who did the county museum and the airport and things like that. I was given a project. I was very lucky because I was very young to design and develop, and I just got so excited about it. I was coming in the evenings, on weekends, and all the rest of it, which I did for about 3 months. And then the project got pulled for reasons that had nothing to do with me. And I was driving home, and that night, I almost hit a tree. And I thought, what is this? And I realized that the desire for control was much greater than I had imagined. And that's what the frustration was. So I said, well, this is not going to get better. This is going to get worse. So maybe I should just do painting.
You know, I'll tell you, I did a series for Westways magazine in 1961. And I was in architecture school. I was still in architecture school. I think at that time it was at Berkeley. And I proposed to Westways that I do what I thought to be significant historical buildings in Southern California. And the publisher, I just approached her, you know, out of the blue, and made the suggestion, and showed her some drawings that I'd done. She said, "Well, look, let's do a series for a year, see how it works out." So I'd go out every month and, you know, do another building, and then they would give me $100 for first publishing rights. And I thought, well, that's good. And then somebody would always want to buy it for some reason, the drawing, and I'd sell it for $300. So I had $400 income in 1961, which was enough to cover my costs with a wife and 2 kids. Hard to believe, isn't it? But at any rate, it did.
It was when architecture was taught then, and I think to a certain degree it still is, it was taught as the ultimate art form, which meant that, well, in school, you didn't have a client, you didn't have a building department, you didn't have all their minimal sort of conditions that you had to deal with. So in a way, it was like building sculpture. I'll do this, and you know, that kind of stuff, and it was great. And then you get into the real world, you know, and it's like, not quite like that. Excuse me. So, that's the only reason. It was just about the kind of effort and energy that I put into something, and the poor baby, it didn't happen. So I thought this is, you know, this is, as I said, this is going to get more so. So maybe I should take a look at it and look at what is troubling me here.
So I said, the hell with this, and that's when I went to UCLA and got a master's in fine arts. I was taking a sculpture class, which was part of one of the requirements, and I had an idea about making a plaster cube.
And the nature of the project was such that I thought maybe I could do this in resin, because I remember this clear material. This is after I had glazed the surfboard. I'd never worked with the material. I didn't know anybody who did, but what I liked about it was that it was water. It was like water. Given the fact that I spent my life here, or grew up here, next to the beach, and surfed, and all that other stuff that's associated with Southern California.
We lived right on the ocean. This is for 10 years. This is from 1940 to 1950. And I was born in 39, so most of my childhood was spent on the peninsula in Newport. And it was just a sort of a funky fishing village, not like it is now.
When I was about 7, Mother decided I should have art lessons. Oh yeah, she went out and she bought me a palette. I mean, the one you put your thumb through. It was a very fancy one, and all the, brushes and everything. And I had this little box, at age 7, where I had the palette and the tubes of paint and the brushes, and I'd take that to this class, and open it up and put my thumb through it, mix the paints and paint. I just remember I liked the woman who taught. She was probably in her 20s, and I remember the consensus was that I was extremely precocious. I mean, it made people ooh and ah, whatever I did. So that must have made a dent somewhere, So I figured, well, I like the oohing and the ahhing, so I guess I'll do more of that to get oohing and ahhing. One evening, my parents had been out at the Jack and Jill bar, and they came home around 2 o'clock. Why would I remember the Jack and Jill bar? But they came home and woke my brother and I up, and took us outside, and the entire sky was falling. It was one of the most awesome things I have ever seen. It was a meteor shower that was one of the most visible showers of the century. And I remember sitting on the sand dunes at sort of in the middle of the night, watching the sky fall. I think that, in fact, I'm quite sure that experience has affected and influenced visually everything I've done ever since. I sort of never forgot it.
Most of the things that most of us do, or at least certainly me, were absorbed at that time and the strongest, because you're so open to stuff. And it's just cycles. They just keep repeating itself.
When something, it's like fluorescent water. I mean, there's nothing more exciting to me than seeing, phosphorescent water, or fireflies, things like that. For some reason, they go click, and I go, oh my God! It's like it's something. It's so much in the it. They come from that kind of thing comes from a place which I think is heaven, whatever that may be. It's so exotic. It's so godlike, spiritual, maybe. All it has to do is glow, and I'm hooked.
And in my senior year, you do an exhibit, and this was 1968. And I did this exhibit of cast resin pieces, some of the first ones that I'd done, and it was a big hit. And next thing you know, I'm asked to do a show in New York, and I was still in graduate school, and I thought, Jesus, how does this happen? You know, dealers are now they're going directly to graduate schools and picking out who it is it's just like it's like the NFL. In those days, it was unheard of. I mean, just it wasn't necessary or whatever. The art world was so much smaller. So, so I was fortunate and unfortunate in the sense that I got a fair amount of sort of activity right out of school, which meant I thought, oh, maybe I am sort of hot shit. You think that for a very short time, but you go there. And I thought, well, this isn't difficult, Oh, I love it. So I did that. I worked with the resins and sort of, got involved in the marketplace. And it was very successful. I was not interested in color in the 60s. That was not my function. I mean, I didn't see it as of real interest to me. I was much more interested in the refraction of light, or how light would go through a translucent or transparent object and what it looked like inside. I mean, these boxes that I made at that time, they were really rooms, in a sense, from given architecture. They were rooms that I put myself into. The intended response to these objects is that they are kind of magical. That is, there is something in them that explains themselves, or they justify themselves because of something they do. And that was very clear. It was not a cerebral process. It was not, it was pure gut. It was like, how does this taste? Oh, I like this taste, One of the things that was kind of wonderful was that we had this concentration of people who were interested in pretty much the same thing, manifesting it all differently. And somebody would do something and maybe have a show, Doug Wheeler, or something, and you go, wow. And then you'd say, I can do better than that. So there was immediate, like this, which is fantastic because it pushes everybody. I think it was us against us. We had it was a good group, different. Each one was totally unique. But what I got most out of it was that it was a club, and for better or for worse. And I got a membership in the club, Oh, it was Billy. I did a show. I had a piece in a show in Fullerton. It was small images, open, to anybody. And Billy and Bill Wilson were the judges. Billy saw a box that I put in, which was a cast, clear box, a little color, and he just went crazy for it. So, and Bill Wilson said, "I know who did that." So Bill Wilson brought Billy down to the house, which is the old house in downtown LA on Estrella, 2119, and that's where I was living at the time. So Billy came down. He got really excited about what I was doing, and he was my introduction to the art world.
He was the king of the hill, and he was the movie star, and he loved playing that role. He was good at it, and so then Joe Good came down, and Ed Ruscha came down, and so on and so forth. So I was part of the bunch, and it was um, for me uh, it was a reason for excitement because I was kind of in isolation doing what I was doing, casting resin. And nobody else was, as far as I knew, and so you couldn't talk to anybody about it, except And so he and I did a show in Minneapolis in the early '70s, and uh, we had to make an announcement. And the dealer in Minneapolis was gay, and virtually everybody who would come to his openings were gay, and would buy, That's not exclusive, but So Billy said, "Come on, we're going to do an announcement." He said, "Put on your tuxedo and meet me down at the Biltmore downtown, and in the presidential suite." And so uh, there was Billy and me in the presidential suite, getting room service in this, and we were sort of lying in this huge bed, clothed. And the suggestion was there, and let's see, Joe Good was shooting it, Jerry McMillan was shooting it, and Ruscha was shooting it, and so there was a whole bundle of people, and uh, it went over as like a rocket in Minneapolis. The place was jammed. That was that. So I'm always indebted to him for actually many things, but.
There was a group of us out here of maybe 10, 12 people. Everybody sort of, operated, knew each other. And we would do, it was like minor rock and roll. We would do these shows in various towns across the country, like Kansas City, Akron, Chicago, etc. And it was like, as I say, it was like being on the road in a minor rock and roll band. And you have the groupies, and all that stuff came along with it. And they, meaning the powers that be, press, etc., they just really didn't know what to make of what we were doing, and because what we were doing could only be seen through the East Coast eyes. There was nothing else to give it credibility except East Coast eyes, and they didn't, right? Yeah, no, there were dealers in New York who some really responded to what we were doing. The public didn't particularly, but there was some enthusiasm. But I want to read you a quote. This is written by a guy named Joseph Maychek, and he was a writer for Artforum. There is that whole shallow, indulgent Republic of Trivia aspect to Southern California, which reminds us here in New York that not since the invention of bronze casting has anything of consequence happened in that climate. That's a key issue, climate. Also, the prospect of hip young dropout types hanging out in Venice, California, making fancy baubles for the rich amuses us. So that's what we were up against.
institution for the arts here at that time was in Exposition Park downtown. It was the Natural History Museum. We shared it with Natural History. And I remember seeing a show there of Philip Guston, and when he was doing his abstract paintings. And I distinctly remember looking at one painting, but I couldn't see the whole thing because there was a dinosaur head coming in over here. So if there's no, so this, at that time, there was no structure to support the arts. Charlie Coles had Art Forum briefly, but he took that to New York. It was in San Francisco, then it came here, and then it went out. There was 5 collectors, maybe. What else? Nobody to write about anything. Well, the LA Times had, had an art section, but it didn't go outside LA. So there you go. That's sort of, what the status was. And so you could do anything you wanted because nobody cared. I mean, had I continued the residence, I would have had no economic problems. That's for some time, but that was not the case. So did it for maybe 4 to 5 years, and then I got sick from the resin, even though I used all the sort of precautions of, masks and ventilation and all the rest of it. So that sort of put a damper on the residence. So I just stopped. A lot of rhetoric came into the art world about that time, explaining various things, the various movements that were going on, which needed a lot of explaining. So I was sort of I thought, this sucks. And I said, I think what I'd like to do is to make pictures, real obvious pictures. And I thought the most obvious of pictures would be a sunset. You certainly don't have to explain anything. But the challenge is, well, what do you do? I mean, what do you do that makes that hasn't been done, or that would excite the viewer into seeing how beautiful these things are. So now, simultaneous with this was the site which we lived on was 1,500 feet up, and it had this incredible view right down to the Malibu Pier. And there was nothing in front of us except this canyon. And in the beginning, I had a studio down here. And then eventually I built one up there, which was not a good idea. Because nobody, you think that you're so hot, or you think you're so significant, that people would actually drive up to see you. No, they don't. It started out, I would take pictures of the sunset, which would set, right there in front of us. And then after doing a series of pictures, I thought, well, why don't I do some drawings? And I did these small sort of reportage of what I was looking at without just trying to, mimic what I saw. And then that got a little bit more elaborate. And eventually I did sunsets on velvet, because the logic that I was using, which is if it's a cliche, then why not see if you can do that on velvet? Because that'll be a nice thing to push against, to try and make work.
Again, going back to the cycle idea, there's always a certain edge in whatever it is that I do for reasons that I couldn't explain. But for an example, the velvet, I see the black velvet as being extremely beautiful and very seductive as a material. but it also has an associative quality which is slightly anxious, meaning it's reminiscent of sort of cheap painting in Tijuana. So it has associations that to me are exactly 180 on how I feel about the material and about what it evokes for me.
I like it because it's so black, and there's no other thing like, there's no black like it. So the response to it was sort of retro, you know, poor guy sliding back. This was not a hit record.
Whenever I get involved in something that's kind of new, or it's new for me, or an idea that I had not worked with before, there is an editing process that goes on. That is, you will go this way, not that way, and then when you go that way, then you'll go that way, and it's that path that you take that is totally intuitive, and all you can do is follow that path, and you have no idea why, none. That's the part that is so mysterious. I don't know what it is that I do it's not unique to me. I think it's anybody. You exude something that people respond to, so something is being communicated, but you don't have the vaguest idea what it is. I mean, I don't have any idea what it is. And you sometimes think it's all just hype, that there's really nothing there because you can't identify it.
A bunch of us, we used to go to the 22nd Street Landing in San Pedro, and we'd get on this boat that would take you out to San Clemente Island overnight. And you'd get on the boat at midnight, then you'd sleep on it, then you get up and fish, and then they'd bring you back. And we used to do it sort of as a group. Kanzer did it, Joe Good, Ruche, myself, maybe one or two others. So we wouldn't sleep, we'd play cards and drink. But what happens with the boat is that it stops in mid-channel to pick up bait, which in this case is squid. So it stopped, and to gather the squid, they have this searchlight on top that they aim down at the water. It's very bright, and the squid are attracted to that light just like flames, moths to flames. But here's the picture. Pitch black, no horizon line. The Santa Ana winds are blowing, so it must have been in the fall sometime. And there's this arc of light and the pink squid going like this, outside of which was a whale. There may have been two, but it's maybe just my imagination, but there was a whale that was blowing phosphorescence, because at that time, the water was like that. And I said, Jesus Christ, this is what the velvets should be. So that was the inspiration for doing large bottom of the ocean velvets. the big velvets I used applique. And so I went down to downtown LA to the bridal shops and got some of the tackiest material you could imagine, and then had it sewn on. And these were sort of abstractions. Some of them were, the biggest one was 8 by 40 feet. These are large, soft paintings, and I didn't stretch them because I wanted them to have an emotional softness to them. And so, like quilts, and with the velvet, the bigger the piece, the deeper you fall, because velvet has that quality where you sort of want to fall into it, and you have this deep space, the type of deep space which is you physically respond to. And that was the place I wanted to play in, as opposed to explaining what these things are that I'm making. And that was the rhetoric that was going around town. And that was a time in which I actually cared, and I used to read Art Forum, and all that stuff. So, God, that was a tough time. The 70s were almost an impossible time from the point of view of revenue. It was in Vietnam War, it was the gas lines, it was interest rates at 18%. That doesn't breed, economic activity.
The sunsets, and I stayed with that image for some time, better or worse. In fact, it was that image that carried me into painting. I was never a painter. I did a lot of drawing, a lot of work on paper, but not painting. And I think the first painting I really did seriously was 1985, something like that. In 1980, I was getting a divorce and felt obviously pretty awful and absolutely flat broke. So I went to India. I was asked to go. There's a family called the Sarabhais, and they're a fantastic family who have asked artists to come over for some time, mostly sort of New York luminaries. So I felt, gee whiz, am I going to be in this group? So Linda Beglis, who was an old friend, was instrumental in this whole thing. So I went to India, and I did some work there. This is when I was still involved with the velvets, with the large velvets. And I wanted to continue that in India, but you couldn't get velvet in India. So I used mosquito netting and layered mosquito netting to get sort of deep space. So I had a great time in India. Usually the artists would stay for about a month, and I stayed for 4. And they didn't mind. But my point is that about 3 years after, I had this dream. And the dream was about the jungles at the Sarabhais. And the dream told me how many paintings to make, what materials to use, like what color they should be. And I got up the next morning and started making them. They were painted in indigo, one color. And I mixed the indigo with wax, a wax stuff that's like mashed potatoes. And I applied most of it with my hands. You kind of pick it up like this and go, and then you can draw, And then I draw through it with an etching needle to get a very fine line. And these jungles were all about how light came through the trees.
whatever aesthetic that I use or I gravitate to is part of that experience, and that keeps being re-experienced in one way or another. I mean, in other words, there's an association that can be made, and it reminds me of those meteors. And those meteors, or that meteor shower, or that time, was probably for me a time of great comfort. The fact that the meteor shower occurred at a time of year in which the Santa Ana winds were blowing. And then I talk about the being out in the ocean, and when I saw the squid or the bait on the boat, and all that happened this about the same time of year, and it was an experience of great warmth and comfort. And so I keep gravitating to images that are associated with those times. The paintings that the LAX paintings, which are of the looking over the LA or the city at night, is reminiscent of that meteor shower. It's of these lights that are moving, and it has this sort of wonderful absurdity of polka dots. That is these dots that sort of go on endlessly. And I remember the story of the Aborigine who was flying into Los Angeles for the first time, and looked out the window and sort of said to his companion, "Why are we flying upside down?" And so that's the perfect connection between, the meteor shower in LA at night.
I wanted to keep the idea of the deep space because we have a physical reaction to deep space, and that to me is authentic. It's not a lot of words. So in order to do that, I did the LAX paintings, which were off the horizon line, off of the distance, and the lights of LA, and the skies of LA, which are so ominous sometimes. I was up in Topanga in the mid-'70s, looking over the valley. And I saw these lights, ting, 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 ting. Drawing lights like that are the same thing as the black velvet. It just sucks you in. And that's where the LAX came from. And those were really, I love doing them. So I did those. They were a lot of fun, and they were sort of a hit record. And then we had the riots in the early '90s. And I'm sure the rest of the country, or certainly the rest of LA, were looking at the riots on TV. And so I was using Polaroids at the time. So I took a bunch of small Polaroids of the TV when the choppers would go over, and you would see the flames at night, and they were really absolutely seductive and terrifying. So I did a series of very small paintings, sort of TV-sized paintings in black and white. they were on a panel, a very finely sanded panel, and they were done with with acrylic, but a very washy acrylic. So I just sort of washed it, and I'd sponge it with a sponge, to pick up other tonalities. Wood panels, mahogany, that had been sanded, gessoed, sanded, gessoed, sanded, gessoed. They were very, very smooth. They were like, you touch them and they go, ooh. And that's why the washes were so good. So that's what they were. And I showed them, I think a year later, to Jim Corcoran at his gallery in Santa Monica on 5th. Not a word. Not a word. Nothing. Just zip, zip, zip. Oh, that was too good. So I said, well, these are not these are not going to be a hit record right now. So let's put it. And I just stored them away. Oh, at that same time, I spent a lot of time at night driving around LA, taking pictures at night of various things like 7-Eleven. And most of it was in black and white. And then I did some paintings based on that.
It's all those things that are sort of unexpected and but give pleasure, and hopefully give some kind of anxiety at the same time. Not necessarily fear, but I think that's a little bit harsh because the objects are very beautiful, but they might kick in a kind of wonderment that would make somebody think or a little anxious. In the past, certainly in the past 10 years, I've responded to places, like places will cause, I'll go to places and I'll respond to a place, and then what I put on the paper or whatever is a response. And so I was sort of running out of Los Angeles in a way as a place to respond to. And then by sort of coincidentally went to Las Vegas and thought, well, this is a good place to respond to. And I responded first of all to all that brilliant illumination, all that stuff that glows, and to the signage. And then simultaneous, I responded to the fact that it's so awful. But yet that, of course, is what's so appealing about it, is that how can something be so awful and so beautiful at the same time? And then how do you take that, this is my mind working, then how do you take that and put it on, make paintings out of it, or make images, or whatever? What do you do with it? And it seemed to be a significant challenge. And the challenge of that was certainly of interest.
The whole tone of LA was really depressed. And so I wanted to get out, and so I went to Las Vegas thinking, all these lights, okay? And I did a few paintings based on the lights, but it didn't seem to get my sense of what Vegas was. So I was at Caesar's Palace, and they have these terrible imitation statues in the front. Or they did, I'm not sure they do now. And so I did variations on those.
Well, the Las Vegas paintings, the ones that I found most successful were the ones of the statues, the glowing statues at Caesar's. And those were made in such a way that, and this is all sort of very purposeful, was that as you got closer to the painting, the image evaporated. And because it represented to me what Las Vegas was like, which is that you don't know what to grab hold of. You don't know what's there. You certainly don't know what's real. for all the obvious reasons. But yet there is something about Las Vegas that is not only very seductive, but in a way, we don't want to recognize the fact that we can be seduced with such ease and with such in such a democratic way, as if none of us are immune from whatever Las Vegas is and how you've been manipulated by Las Vegas. I think in a way irritates people because you cannot not be attracted to it, and yet you're sort of repulsed at the same time. And in a way, that's what the way I painted these statues was with that in mind, that they are these beautiful sort of glowing creatures that you cannot grab a hold of. I had no intention of getting involved in those images, or in images like that, because I was going to do landscape, like street scenes and things like that. But then I got into figures, and it started to be, and it was a whole different deal. I thought that I could make them glow, and by making them glow, I could get an image that was very simple and straightforward, a singular image, which I've also always been attracted to. And then I could sort of make it potent or give it another kind of potency by making it glow. And then incidentally, there's all the historical overtones that come along with it, which were only of moderate interest. I mean, I didn't get into those statues because of their historical significance.
I was doing water paintings, which were based on reflections of light on water, on the ocean. So what I did, I imitated the markings of the light on the water, and what I found was that if the water were one color, and I played against it, I could get an optical effect, which would even exaggerate the fact that you can't look at light on water in the ocean, because, for the obvious. So Frank Gehry, who's an old friend, he saw some of these and really liked them. And he said, why don't you do one for Disney? And I said, sure. So I got all, juiced up, and I brought my paper bag, for lunch. And I worked on these things, the painting for every day, practically. 9 to 5, and for 3 months. And I had a wall built here so that I could put it up, and I was very happy with it. And but no officials were making any move to use it, and we waited around and waited around, and Frank said one day, he said, "Let's put it up." So he got all this people who would do scaffolding and stuff and did it, and we put it up, and that was it. And nobody else said anything. The light was coming in from the right, and then it sort of went through the painting, and then the last panel maybe had one little red dot on it, but you can see the washes on the panels, which is a very delicate stuff. When we, meaning the Light and Space Group, started getting revived, and probably the first indication of that was Zwirner in New York did a show of Light and Space, and finish the names. With had all the boys, Terrell and Irwin and Kaufman, and me and everybody. And that was the first time that an exhibit of these objects had been put together in New York since, I think, the 70s. I wouldn't guarantee that, but close. So you had several generations who had never seen this work. And when Zwirner did the show, he did a really good job. So when we started, that was about the time when we started getting more attention again. And it was seen by the outside as something of value. In fact, Peter Sheldall, he was out here in the 60s, and he, at that time, he was fairly dismissive of what was going on. And he wrote a review of the Zwirner show, and he sort of apologized for 40 years of ignorance, which was an interesting, that was, whether true or not, let's say it was true, and that's exactly the way the rest of the world was 40 years of ignorance, more or less. So now we're wonderful, and who knows how long that's going to last. But I was going to tell you why I got back into the material. That's what started this. Well, because of all this new interest, the Pompidou did a show of California art, and they had a piece of mine, which was from the 60s, and they broke it before the show opened because they didn't hang it properly. Excuse me. So there was a lot of press around that issue, and I didn't realize they had broken it until they broke a Craig Kaufman, and the Craig Kaufman was owned by the County Museum. So it had to become public then. I owned the one that they used, and they never told me about it because why tell that ass, So there was a big hoopla about all that, about mine and Craig, and what's the Pompidou doing, et cetera. And so for about 20 seconds, I was world famous. I got calls from Argentina, from Germany, from
France, everywhere, anywhere, everywhere. And they wanted to ask me what was happening at the Pompidou. Like, how did this happen? So the Pompidou said, okay, we'll pay to have another one made. Okay, so then I had to find somebody to make it. I wasn't going to make it. So, shoot forward a bit, and I found a company to do it. And we used urethane rather than polyester, because the urethane is, comparatively speaking, unbreakable. And that's how I got back into the material. And I knew that when I took it back up again in '09, that there was going to be some stuff float my way about, there he is. He finally gave in. Now he's doing a repeat, and I never thought he'd do it, but there he is. So I don't see any of it as a repeat, simply because of the color and because of what I can do with the material. It doesn't. The resin I use now does not smell like polyester, which now I smell it and I get a headache. But and I have somebody else working with it, so all I do is sort of mix the color and decide on the shape and things like that. That's how I got back into it. And while this bar was being made, I saw what this material could do, and so I got re-excited. And because of it, and again, because of the nature of the material, I could do things that I could never have done in polyester. And the most vivid example being the edges of these bars, which go right to a razor thin. If you did that with polyester, they'd all crack off. With this stuff, no problem. You just sort of, it gives. Experimenting with this is a lot of fun, still is. What makes one different from the other is its translucency and its color and its surface. So those are the three variables. So the pastry tray over there, that's how I started using this material again, was that I started doing color and samples of color and to see how to use that color. And that's sort of how I got to the shapes of these bars, is all based on the color and how intense it gets and how transparent it is and all that kind of stuff. So in essence, the shapes are determined, and then it's a question of taking advantage of that shape that you've chosen to do. And you realize that sometimes there's many variations that you can play with, and other times much less so. And in this case, I could go on forever mixing color. The issue, I think the question is, is that enough to keep me excited? I don't know. It is now, but we'll see. So I can play with these, and what I'll do is take the ammo is on this rack here, and just bring it over and start shifting and try this next to this next to this. I did the bar idea, meaning something that was sort of in relief that hugged the wall, is something I did in the '60s, and those pieces were mostly monochromatic. In other words, it was more about let's put it this way, it was not about color. So, which meant that the bars that were organized in the '60s, they were almost interchangeable, even though there were variations in color by nuances of color shifts. You can put anyone next to the other. In this case, you cannot. I mean, in other words, you realize that this one next to that one is better than any other one I've seen next to that one. But what also happens is that sometimes you do a casting where one piece works. It does something on the wall that means it can be on its own. But it also works as in the group. Everything sort of happens in a sequence, and they're little pushes that put things wherever they may go.
What I get excited about is that when I take some of those and stick them up over here, things will start to happen. You get groupings that if you did it intentionally, you never get there. You never do it. So that's what I start with, and then build it from there. They actually sort of make music. They're like musical notes that go through like you get 3 that would really work together, or 4 that would be something like this, and that would make one sound, and then you get 2, and that'd make another sound, and there you go. They weren't intended to be that. I mean, that's just the way it worked out.
I always wanted them to do something, whatever it was that I was making, that if it can't be inert. And so that's why I think I take those edges the way I do, because they're sort of alarming, and you don't know quite what to make of them. Where do they end? That kind of stuff. So that sets up a slight spark, and then you can enjoy the rest of it. I've done some other pieces that are squares or puffs, with with loose edges. That's painting. That's Rothko. So I think something physical, something sensual, not necessarily something cerebral, although they might by accident.
The pictures that I made in that span of 30 years were all pictorial representations of exactly the same interests, except I just sort of made it more graphic. Like a sunset is a good example of color and atmosphere, and the same issue goes into these.
You got it. You got it. Yep. 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 No, this has not crossed my mind, what you're saying, and I really appreciate what you're saying. I do. Yes, I do. Yeah. I never thought of it that way, but that's what you get. Thank you.